presentation is We Be Talkin', the Structure and Complexity of African American English. The question I'm posing here is what makes African American English distinct, and how does that function as a complex mode of communication? So for the sake of focus and time, I'm going to limit it. There are a whole lot of grammatical structures and lexical and phonetic features that have to do with African American English, and we're sticking to 4 grammatical features, so hopefully you'll get a sense of all of the stuff that comes into this topic without actually having to go into all of the details. In order to really dive into it, though, there are a few assumptions that have to be made and a few definitions we have to agree upon, so I'm going to kind of lay those out and then we'll actually get started. First and foremost, you've probably heard words like Ebonics in African American English and Black English and African American Vernacular English all thrown around, and they all have somewhat overlapping and somewhat similar definitions. For the sake of this presentation and consistency, we're going to use African American Vernacular English, henceforth AAVE, because it's easier to say. Also, linguists often struggle with the definition and distinction between language and dialect, and there's a whole discourse behind it, and I'm happy to talk about it with you anytime, not tonight. But again, for the sake of this presentation, I'm going to use probably language and dialect interchangeably. Don't think that it has necessarily any deeper meaning than that. Also, hidden in this is the assumption that AAVE exists and is distinct from Standard English, has distinctive features. We're not going to be going into the roots of AAVE. There are a couple primary theories about that again, I'm happy to talk about another time, but all you really need to know is that both of the primary theories end up suggesting that AAVE has distinct features, but is also shares some features with Standard English. So again, the question, what makes AAVE distinct, is the first part of that question, and then how does that function as a logical and complex mode of communication? If you look in front of you, you have an interview. I apologize that there's some profane language in it. This is from the work of William LaBeouf, who's primary researcher in the field, an interview that he did. Again, I apologize for the language, but this happens to be an interview that highlights all 4 of the grammatical features that we're going to be focusing on tonight. So I'm going to kind of lay out what those features are, and then I'm going to go into more detail with them, so don't be scared if you don't have any idea what I'm talking about at first. I promise you will. So first of all, you see an instance of negative inversion. So that's that part that's highlighted that says, does nobody know? We also have negative concord, which is where you see, you ain't going to know heaven. We also have optional zero copula. Again, don't freak out with the jargon. I'm going to explain it in a little bit. That's the part at the top where you see if you're good, paralleled with the line below it where it says if you bad. And then there's the feature of the invariant be, which I have a personal favorite feature of the linguistic system, if that's possible, and it's the invariant be, and we'll talk about that. That's at the bottom where it says when they be saying. So we're going to talk at first about negatives. First I had talked about negative inversion. That's that doesn't nobody know part of your interview. This is exactly what it sounds, where the negative is inverted to the beginning of the phrase. The way that it works grammatically, it's kind of hard to picture in your head because, again, these are just grammatical forms. But essentially, a clause initial auxiliary. So when you have a there is at the beginning of the sentence, and you want to negate that. So take the sentence, there's nothing bothering her. If you want to say that with the structure, the grammatical structure of AAVE, by taking the there is and inverting it, of course this takes into account different lexical features like ain't, and you have an indefinite subject. So an indefinite subject is nothing or something or anything, and it happens to be negative, so nothing. Then you're able to move that ain't to the beginning. So it goes from there is nothing bothering her to ain't nothing bothering her. Basically just taking that is and moving it because of the grammatical features of AAVE. So that's a negative inversion. The second negative one is negative concord. You've probably heard of double negatives. This is the more technical term for this, but also implies that there's the capability to have indefinite numbers of negatives in the same phrase that are emphasizing the same notion. I want to just point out that for both of these, there's a tendency to think that they're poor grammar. Especially when we're dealing with negatives in Standard English, people are very, very careful about saying what's proper and what's not. AAVE is very consistent with these grammatical forms, which is why I'm suggesting that they are grammar and not poor grammar. They're distinctive features. In fact, you see in studies that speakers of AAVE produce these forms 70, 80, 90% of the time that they're employing that kind of sentence. The second part is this copula behavior. This word copula means the linking or passive verb. If you remember that from grade school, high school, I don't know. The one that we're going to focus on is the verb to be. The first feature I mentioned was optional zero copula, and that sounds really daunting, but it's actually pretty self-explanatory. There's the option of having zero copula. So in standard English, where we contract, where we go from you are to your, in AAVE, there's the option to remove the copula entirely and just have, like you see in your interview, you good, or you bad. Of course, this presentation, like I said, doesn't cover all of the lexical and semantic features of AAVE, and there are other things incorporated in that. Again, I'm happy to discuss them another time, but that's one that you see predominantly when we're talking about AAVE. Then comes my very favorite part, like I mentioned, the invariant be. That's where the title of this presentation, We Be Talkin', comes from. In standard English, we have the capability to say we are talking, or we were talking, or we talk on a regular basis. In AAVE, oftentimes, like I said, the copula is dropped, so it would be we talk. But you also have the capability of saying that something happens habitually by adding the full copula of the be. So it was, instead of saying we talk on a regular basis, it would say we be talking. This is my favorite because it is very clearly a distinct grammatical feature. It's not necessarily, it can't really be distinguished or misinterpreted as poor grammar because it's something that's added to the language that standard English doesn't necessarily have. So those are four primary grammatical features. I just want to mention that because of this consistency that I'm pointing out, this 70 and 80 and 90% use by AAVE speakers, there's grounds to say that AAVE is completely legitimate, whether as a language or a dialect, it's kind of up to your discretion. But that, of course, has lots of social implications. So if you think about what it means to call AAVE a legitimate language or a legitimate communication style, and think about what that means for speakers of AAVE. Now, a lot of speakers of AAVE can communicate in both standard English and AAVE, but if we're recognizing AAVE as legitimate, what does that mean in terms of access to higher education, access to employment, and general social barriers that we see on a regular basis? There are a lot of critics that say, especially with the copula treatment, that people can drop the be and can add the be in different kinds of sentences, that AAVE doesn't represent a good sense of past and present tense and future tense. But like I've mentioned, the consistency kind of negates that idea. So there are things to think about. Again, those are just four general grammatical features of AAVE, and now come all of these social implications. So I'm going to leave you with the structure piece and maybe leave the social implications as something for you to think about. Again, I'm happy to talk about any of that in questions, but also at a later time.